Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining me on this final session as we continue and conclude tonight our journey through the thought of Maimonides. I've tried to, over the course of this journey, tried to highlight some what I think are really the core themes of his thought, both to display and demonstrate why he is absolutely considered a towering, monumental figure in the Jewish tradition in terms of the impact of his life, his thought, his approach to Judaism, on the one hand, and on the other, why he evoked controversy and provoked pushback with respect to the religious agenda that he tried to circulate in the Jewish world. So we'll continue that journey tonight. There is an enormous amount of material about Maimonides, both from a traditional perspective with respect to his Jewish legal work, and I've tried to touch on that, and with respect to his philosophical themes. So I've really had to cherry pick what I think are some themes that will allow you to appreciate and understand where he was coming from, um, where he was trying to go, and why there were obstacles in his way in the Jewish world. So again, tonight we'll take a look at the elements of the Jewish world that he was trying to purify, that he was trying to refine, um, to only a certain degree of success, and the aspects and features of his agenda that were successful ultimately. We can really measure Maimonides' impact on the Jewish world by the wide-ranging influence he still has, and we're going to get to that near the end of tonight's session. So he certainly has really pervasive impact on the Jewish world, yet much of the Jewish world is either oblivious to or resistant to certain aspects of his thought. So with that introduction, I'm going to share my the final source sheet. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. So we're finally at the last session. Again, this class could go on for years in terms of the amount of material there is to cover. But I'm hoping by the end of this source sheet and the end of our discussion, you'll have a good feel for where Maimonides was coming from and the extent of his influence on the Jewish world. As we go along, you can keep in mind this photo of him or this drawing of him. I don't know if we have any evidence of what he actually looked like, but again, he was born in Spain, but ended up in Egypt. So he traveled within the Jewish world, and the influence of his Spanish culture really never left him. So let's get back into the text. I'm going to have a few more texts about what I think is really an essential topic that we discussed at length last time, anthropomorphism and the Maimonidean approach to reading the Bible figuratively or metaphorically or allegorically in light of any passages in the Torah that were inconsistent with what he thought were demonstrably true philosophic or scientific or logical conclusions. The Torah always had to comport with what advances in science or philosophy or logic dictated. But we saw that resulted in a God in Maimonides' conception that was quite distant and remote, and that many Jews over time really had a problem with that sort of Maimonides' conception of an unchanging and largely unresponsive God. It was not the traditional conception of God that Jews were used to. This is a story relayed in Marc Shapiro's excellent book on Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. And this really goes to this dynamic of, on the one hand, Maimonides' austere sense of monotheism, in which God is absolutely incorporeal, has no physical form at all, and the sense of the common Jew that who wanted God to be closer, less remote, less sort of philosophically depicted. Professor Shapiro writes in his book, in a fascinating story recorded by Rabbi Moses Hagiz, a simple man in Sfat, so this is in Israel, a former Portuguese Marrano. So this is a Jew involved here who was sort of a marginal Jew because he had to conceal his Jewishness. He was within a Christian setting, which very likely influenced him. So that former Portuguese Marrano brought bread to the synagogue every Friday in order for God to eat. The synagogue beadle, the shamash, would actually take the bread away because it was an inappropriate form of worship of the Jewish God. But the man who put it there was convinced that it was God himself who was pleased with his offering. After the local rabbi learned about this, he harshly rebuked the man both for his foolishness and for the great sin he was committing by holding an anthropomorphic conception of God. So that local rabbi, perhaps, was a Maimonidean. However, when Rabbi Isaac Luria, and Rabbi Luria is a very famous rabbi who's the founder of what came to be known as Lurianic Kabbalah, which again is really the sort of, I'll call it the opposing school of thought within Judaism about how we should approach God and conceive of God. When Rabbi Luria heard of this episode, he informed the local rabbi that since the destruction of the temple, God's greatest pleasure was when this simple man brought his bread. Since the rabbi had put a stop to this, it was decreed in the heavenly realm that he should die. And so it happened. And I think the story really captures this dynamic of the rigid incorporeality of God, the strict monotheism that Maimonides tried to promote, which he did fairly successfully. I would say that's one of his most successful efforts, that much of the Jewish world thinks of God as having no physical form. But on the other hand, there were still traces of corporeality in how Jews depicted God. They almost they had an impulse to want God to have physical form so that they could relate to God more closely, more intimately, in a way that Maimonidean followers may have had trouble with. So I think it's an interesting, that story displays that interesting dynamic. On the other hand, this next text is within the last few years, Baruch Schwartz was an important professor of biblical studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he wrote this very interesting article in the Torah.com. Many of you know that's one of my favorite websites. And listen to how he describes our approach to sort of the anthropomorphic features of the Bible that we may look down on now. Professor Schwartz writes, consider these actions, and he's talking about the biblical services that the high priest would perform first in the sanctuary, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then, of course, the priestly class performed similar tasks in each of the two temples in Jerusalem. So he says, consider these actions along with the other tasks the high priest is instructed to execute each morning and evening in the sanctuary, attending to the lampstand to ensure that the sanctuary's interior is illuminated all night long, and offering incense to provide a fragrant aroma, and his weekly presentation and removal of 12 loaves of bread. This is all from, according to the Torah's instructions. All of these rituals are predicated on the sanctuary being God's dwelling place. We talked about that the Bible seems to indicate that God actually has a physical abode. In the wilderness, it was the tabernacle. Later in Jerusalem, it was the temple, which is the meaning of the word Mishkan. That's the Hebrew word used in the Torah. The precisely delineated, extravagantly outfitted earthly location, where his terrestrial manifestation, God's glory, resides. And again, I mentioned in the last session that this notion of God's kavod, God's glory, is almost given material presence, as if it's an entity in and of itself that accompanies God. Of course, Maimonides rejected that approach. Taken as a whole, this complex of ritual acts as none other than a highly formalized way of perpetually attending to God's abode, providing light, fragrance, and refreshment, and in the course of doing so, directing the resident deity's attention to his people's needs and evoking his acceptance of their tribute, all while taking care to respect God's splendid isolation, never intruding unannounced. Well, here's the point. Here's the aspect of this excerpt that I want you to focus on. Many modern Jews seem inclined to view the statutory prayer, meaning the prayer that we engage in today, as opposed to the sacrificial rite in the Torah, that we're inclined to view our statutory prayer that eventually replaced the, quote, royal treatment of God in his earthly abode, meaning in either the sanctuary or the temple, as a step away from what they see as the crude anthropomorphism of early times, and a step in the direction of more spiritualized worship. That's what we're inclined to believe and what we would sort of like to believe. And yet, Professor Schwartz makes the point, the notion of serving God by speaking to him, as we do in our prayers, in sounds forming human language, calling God our Father and our King, addressing to him words of praise and petition, words that he is imagined to, quote, hear, as if by some auditory means, by which God is thought somehow to be moved or affected, and to which it is hoped that God may react favorably. Is this any less anthropomorphic than the silent tribute and supplication offered by means of the high priest's garments? Whether verbally, as we do, or more dramatically, as was done in the tabernacle and temple, to worship God apparently involves making him, and this is the professor's own exclamation point, indicating that we assign gender to our God. So not only do often, I think, I have a feeling in our minds as we pray, we conceive of God having some physical form, but we even in our liturgy assign gender to God. But that's how we make him accessible, imaginable, familiar in ancient times as in our own. I think Professor Schwartz is trying to force us to be perhaps a little self-conscious about our looking down at the temple service as anthropomorphic. It certainly had the trappings of believing that God had corporeal physical form, but he's suggesting that our devotional worship, in which we obviously no longer have a tabernacle or temple, we of course no longer bring sacrifices, is that in fact any less anthropomorphic in our believing that God somehow both hears our prayer and is affected by our prayer? Is it less anthropomorphic simply because we've moved past the time of having a temple? And by the way, I mentioned that Maimonides' conception of prayer is quite complicated. Because he believes in an unchanging God, Maimonides did not believe that God hears our prayers and responds to individual petitions or praise or thanks and acts accordingly. That was not Maimonides' view of an unchanging God. Moving to something that's closely related to the problem of corporeality of God and anthropomorphic depictions of God is Maimonides' broader project. The whole enterprise, I would say this is sort of the overarching enterprise of Maimonides' life and his work, was integrating traditional Torah, traditional Judaism on the one hand, as he understood it, in terms of its pristine form, and scientific reason, philosophical logic on the other. This refers to what's been called the Slifkin affair. I'm not going to talk about it at great length, but it's a really interesting whole episode that happened within the last 20 years or so, involving, at the time, a young ultra-Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Natan Slifkin, who wrote books that in a very Maimonidean fashion tried to show that the Torah, as ultra-Orthodox Jews could understand it, was fully compatible with advances in science, that traditional Jews did not have to believe that the world was only, 5,700 years old, or 5,785 this year, or that the world was literally created in 6 days. Modern traditional Jews did not have to believe that. They could proceed along with the advances in science that science dictated. But when he wrote those books, they were banned in the ultra-Orthodox community of which he was a part, and he was confused by those bans because he intended no harm through them. He wrote, this is after the episode had played out for a number of years, When 3 of my books were banned under the charge of heresy, this was a source of much confusion. He means both to himself and to many other traditional Jews who believed, like him, that the Torah, according to Maimonides, for example, need not have been read literally in terms of scientific advances. It emerged that the respected ultra-Orthodox rabbis who issued the ban were, for the most part, not condemning anything peculiar to my own presentation. Instead, they were condemning 2 positions that I had unquestionably adopted in the books: that the Genesis account need not be interpreted as referring to a literal 6-day creation, and could, in fact, be reconciled with modern science, and even more significantly to them, and this is perhaps surprising, that the sages of the Talmud did not possess knowledge of the natural world beyond what anyone else in their era knew, and were therefore mistaken in some of their statements. Many of us are not used to that perspective, but the ultra-Orthodox perspective is often that Talmudic rabbis are infallible, that the statements that you can find in the Talmud about anything, including many realms beyond just Jewish law, have to be taken as true. And to claim that they were mistaken is heretical in their view. This begged the question that since these positions, meaning the positions that Rabbi Slifkin had advanced in his books, had already been presented by towering Torah authorities of previous generations, how could they be condemned as heretical? And he goes on to say that this Rabbi Aaron Feldman traveled to Israel in order to ask this question of Rabbi Yosef Shalom Al-Yeshiv, the most distinguished of the signatories in the band, and considered by many to be the greatest halachic authority of our day. And the question was, if all these great prior authorities, Rav Shira Gaon, most prominently the Rambam, meaning Maimonides, including, in addition, Maimonides' son, and these other rabbis, if all of those prior great rabbinic authorities could advance similar views that the Torah need not be read literally or anthropomorphically, and it can be read consistently with advances in science, and many others could state such views, how could these views that he is now advancing in the 21st century be considered as heretical? Rav Elyashiv's cryptic reply was, they could say it, we cannot. So this really reflects, what I think is, and I think Rabbi Slifkin believes, is an irrational attachment to certain views, and it may have been this position suggests that it could have been the prerogative of Maimonides and others like him to advance views that are now considered heretical, which speaks to the reality of whether Maimonides' views really won the day or not. Certainly in at least part of the ultra-Orthodox world, they did not. So they certainly have respect from Maimonides, who still has immense prestige in that world, but people 800 years later cannot say similar things without being branded as heretical. Okay, so let's move past the issue of anthropomorphism and the incorporeality of God to other issues that I think are really integral to Maimonides' thought that in this last session I want you to have an appreciation for. This issue is, I'm going to contrast Maimonides on the one hand to Nachmanides on the other. Nachmanides lived about 50 years after Maimonides was born, so they actually overlapped a bit in time, 50 or 60 years. So Nachmanides was a couple of generations after Maimonides, but Nachmanides held Maimonides in great regard, but differed from him in crucial respects with respect to how to approach Jewish law, how to approach conceptions of God, how to approach interpreting the Torah. Nachmanides is considered one of the sort of forefathers of the Kabbalistic tradition, so it's not surprising that he disagreed very vigorously with some of Maimonides' conclusions. And Maimonides really had what I'm going to show is an evolutionary approach to the development of Jewish law, whereas Nachmanides believed, as we saw last time, I brought a text showing that the Torah is eternal, that the Torah existed before the world was even created, and that God consulted the Torah in creating the world. Therefore, the Jewish law embodied in the Torah is itself also eternal and not historically contingent. That was Nachmanides' view. So let's start out with Maimonides' view. I'll just map out, I'm going to get to then the contrast to Nachmanides, and then wrap up this section with a bit more about Maimonides. But Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, his great philosophical works, this little section that I'm presenting is about the history of sacrifices in Judaism, which, if you open up the Torah, is an important feature of biblical, of both the biblical text and a biblical practice, biblical worship of God. Maimonides, though, has a very novel, not non-traditional view of the place of sacrifices in our tradition. In the guide, Maimonides wrote, "The Torah tells us clearly that the ancient Egyptians worshiped the constellation Aries. So they prohibited, meaning the Egyptians prohibited slaughtering sheep, and they hated shepherds. Beyond that, some Sabian sects, the Sabians are sort of a targeted group in the Guide of the Perplexed, who lived apparently in his time, that Maimonides thought Maimonides thought the Sabians were quite idolatrous. So it says, beyond that, some Sabian sects worshipped jinn, which are sort of superhuman genies, and believed they took a goat form. Such beliefs were quite widespread in the days of our teacher Moses. No more shall they sacrifice to goats, Leviticus says. So these sects forbade eating goat meat, and slaughtering cattle was abhorrent to nearly all pagans. They all venerated these beasts. So you'll find even today that Hindus, this is interesting, it's in the guide, never slaughter cattle, even in lands where other beasts are slaughtered. So he identifies sheep, goat, and cattle as animals that were implicated in idolatrous worship. And that's why the Torah identifies those animals as the animals suitable for sacrifice to the Jewish God. To blot out all trace of such unsound beliefs, we were commanded, meaning the Jews were commanded, to sacrifice animals of these three kinds specifically, of the herd and flock. And he cites to a verse in Leviticus that indicates that we should do so. Maimonides' point here is that the only reason that the Torah indicates that we should sacrifice sheep, goats, and cattle is to teach us that that was the form of idolatrous worship at the time of the Torah. So the thought is, if different animals, let's say camels, were worshipped by idolatrous sects at the time, Maimonides probably would have concluded that God would have instructed the Israelites to sacrifice camels to show that those are not actual divine forces, that those are not godly or divine. So to teach the Israelites that lesson, God chose animals that were actually the subject of admiration in these idolatrous societies at the time. So the point I'm trying to make is, Maimonides believed that the laws of sacrifice presented in the Torah were historically contingent. They were not eternal. They were not the subject of some existence prior to the creation of the world, as Nachmanides and later Kabbalists believed. But the laws in the Torah could have been different had idolatrous practices at the time of the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai been different. So if those idolatrous practices had been different, so too would have been the instructions in the Torah. And I bring this next passage from Leviticus to show that Maimonides was really onto something. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 7 says, "And so," meaning the Israelites, "so that they may no longer offer their sacrifices to the goat demons after whom they stray," meaning the Israelites would otherwise stray from the proper path and offer sacrifices to goat demons, the Seirim. All of this instruction about the details of the sacrifices shall be to them a law for all time throughout the ages. So even the Torah, the plain sense, the pshat of the Torah, seems to be indicating that because there was an environment of worship of goat demons at the time, that's why the Torah fashioned its sacrificial regulations as it did. So even the Torah itself seems to make sacrificial laws seemingly historically contingent. Maimonides continues in the Guide of the Perplexed. So far we've seen that Maimonides explains why the Torah instructs that only certain animals be sacrificed. He goes and makes a broader point that the entire system of sacrificial worship was only because, well, that's the way people worshiped God in those days. In the Guide, Maimonides wrote, the familiar mode of worship, the way of life we grew up in, and he means the Israelites at the time of the Bible, prevalent throughout the world in those days, just meant sacrificing various animals in the temples where those images were erected, bowing down to them and burning incense before them. The pious and devout in those days worshipped only in temples dedicated to the stars, as I explained, meaning everyone was idolatrous, essentially, all around the Israelites at the time. And here's the important point. So with the wisdom and grace evident throughout creation, God did not decree that his law simply annul, reject, and abolish all such worship. So the really important, and again, non-traditional point that Maimonides is making here is that the sacrificial system that is laboriously outlined and detailed in the Torah, much of the book of Leviticus is dedicated to the details of the regulations about which kinds of sacrifice should be brought at which times and how they should be administered. It's a very intricate system. Maimonides is saying all of that was necessary only because God thought he couldn't sort of skip that phase because the people were so used to forms of idolatrous worship and sacrificial forms of that worship, that phase, the phase of sacrifices, needed to be present in Judaism as well, as revealed at Mount Sinai. So again, it's a very historically contingent conception of sacrifices that if only the world had been a little bit different and there had been more room to sort of skip this phase of sacrificial worship, God would actually have preferred it that way. But in God's wisdom and grace, knowing that the people were not ready to accept anything but that form of worship, the entire system of sacrifices was therefore incorporated into the Torah. So here's our first thought experiment of the evening. We're going to have a few thought experiments in this last session. I asked, what would Maimonidean optimal, and I say lechatchila, Judaism look like? For those unfamiliar with the term lechatchila, it's a Talmudic term which means sort of from the outset, in the best possible world, without any complicating factors, if we could, wish for optimal circumstances, what would Maimonidean lechatchila or optimal Judaism look like in this context of sacrifices? So I ask, if God's revelation in the wilderness had skipped sacrificial worship and instead jumped straight to non-sacrificial devotional prayer, meaning of the kind that we engage in today, as God, according to Maimonides, in fact would have preferred it. That's what Maimonides indicates in the Guide, that if God had God's choice, there would be no sacrifices. We would have skipped over that phase. How would Jewish tradition, law, and history have been different? And I say Jewish tradition, law, and history would have been radically different. If the Torah had been able to skip the sacrificial phase, there would likely have been no need for a tabernacle or later a temple in Jerusalem. And by the way, I'm outlining this list of how Judaism would have been different. These are massive changes. It's almost hard to convey how much different Judaism would be without all of these things. Likely no traditional messianic hope of rebuilding any such temple that we wouldn't have needed. Likely no need for a priestly class to administer this form of worship service that we wouldn't need. Likely no need for tithes to support that administrative priestly class that was busy with the temple sacrificial worship and needed to be financially supported. Likely fewer intricate rules regarding ritual purity and impurity. There's a massive part of our Jewish tradition about those rules, which were designed in large part to create awe and love for what went on in the tabernacle and later the temple. So that there would have been no need for all of those intricate rules of purity and impurity. Perhaps no need for three major pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. We're coming up to Shavuot shortly. Remember, ancient Jews in the times of the temple or the temples, made pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, if there were no sacrifices and there would be no need for a temple, there wouldn't be need for that form of our three of our major festivals. Perhaps less centripetal focus on the religious significance of Jerusalem. Again, in this thought experiment, if there were no sacrifices, if there were no temple, if there were no priests, if there were no pilgrimage festivals, perhaps we would have less of a focus religiously on Jerusalem within our tradition. Certainly, and this is without a doubt, we would have hundreds, maybe even thousands of fewer biblical and rabbinical laws. Remember, the 613 commandments are just within the context of the Torah. There's some multiple of that of rabbinic laws. So many hundreds of those, put it this way, a material portion of our Jewish legal tradition would have been unnecessary. Those laws that are focused on any sacrifice related issues, including many entire Talmudic tractates. You can look at the various Talmudic tractates and eliminate almost a dozen of them, I would say, if we didn't have any need for a focus on sacrificial worship. And so for Maimonides, those aspects of what Maimonides believed really were sort of a primitive form of Judaism, and it became obsolete over time. Sacrifices, obviously, we don't engage in sacrifices. There are many Jews, religiously oriented Jews who want to rebuild the temple. Maimonides thought we had moved past the stage of sacrificial worship, and so that was an obsolete form of Judaism. All of that never would have existed in the first place. So this list reflects the fact that our Jewish tradition and our history, even today, the way we view Jerusalem, the way we view what our ancestors did would have been radically different had God been able to do what God wanted to do, according to Maimonides, which is skip over the sacrificial phase and get right to more devotional forms of worship. Now, that's a very provocative way to look at the Torah as historically contingent, as a very material portion of our tradition in terms of the sacrifices as sort of primitive and obsolete and dispensable. And that provoked real significant pushback from others, including Nachmanides, the Ramban, who lived again about 60 years after Maimonides was born and is one of the forefathers of Kabbalistic Judaism. Nachmanides, in his commentary on a passage in Leviticus, but referring to Maimonides' comments on sacrifices, said but these, referring to Maimonides' comments, are mere expressions healing casually a severe wound and a great difficulty, and making the table of the eternal one of God polluted, as if, and Nachmanides is really offended, and I think genuinely so, offended by Maimonides' view of the sacrifices, as if the sacrificial offerings were intended only to remove false beliefs from the hearts of the wicked and fools of the world. By way of truth, and that's Nachmanides' hint that he's suggesting a Kabbalistic insight. By way of truth, there is a hidden secret contained in the sacrificial offerings. And what he means by that is the sacrifices actually fulfilled needs of God, which of course Maimonides would have rejected as totally anthropomorphic and that sort of presuppose in some aspect or to some degree some physicality to God's existence that Maimonides would have found, abominable and heretical. This passage is from the book of Exodus in the Torah. And they shall know, the Israelites shall know, that I, the Lord, am their God, who brought them out from the land of Egypt, so that I might abide among them. I, the Lord, their God. Leshochni vetocham. This root, the shin chaf nun sofit, or the nun here, is God's, what later came to be known as God's presence, but it refers to God dwelling among the people. And again, the traditional patterns of thought that Maimonides was trying to suppress held that God actually did have some physical presence that needed to be accommodated for, and that's why God instructed that we build God a tabernacle in the wilderness and later a temple. Nachmanides, on this passage from Exodus, wrote in his great biblical commentary, there is in this matter a great secret. For in the plain sense of things, so he's saying it's pretty straightforward, it would appear, so the plain sense is actually misleading. It would appear that the dwelling of the divine glory, so that he's referring to the Shekhinah, in Israel was to fulfill a need below. That means it was so that God, we could feel that God was close to us. It would fulfill a need of ours, which is Maimonides' view, but it is not so. Nachmanides totally disagrees with Maimonides. It wasn't to fulfill a human need. It rather fulfilled a need in the divine realm above. That means a need of God. So the tabernacle in the wilderness was, and later the temple in Jerusalem were built, Nachmanides believed, in stark contrast to Maimonides, to fulfill a need of God. And then I add here to sort of flesh out this thought so that you have a better sense of what Nachmanides, the Ramban, really believed, that God actually needed to dwell in the world. This was a need of God, not just God's sort of preference, but this was done interactively so that God's needs could be satisfied. God needed to dwell in the world, specifically among Jews, and later, even more specifically, in a particular place in the world, in the temple in Jerusalem. So, of course, Maimonides would have totally rejected this view. Maimonides and Nachmanides almost couldn't have been farther apart on this conception of the need for the sacrifices, the need for the tabernacle and temple, and in their very conception of God. For Maimonides, God, of course, doesn't have needs that have to be satisfied. And we human beings certainly can do nothing, even if God had such needs, to satisfy them. Nachmanides says, no, there is this interactive dynamic between human beings, really between Jews and God, that we help to facilitate the system in which God's needs can be satisfied. So I tried to give you a taste of Nachmanides, which is a very stark contrast to Maimonides. Let's get back to conclude this section with Maimonides' view. In his book, the Book of Commandments, Sefer HaMitzvot, he lists as positive commandment number 20 from the Torah. He says, by this injunction, and he's referring to the mitzvah of building the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, we are commanded to build a sanctuary for God's service. There, and Maimonides is trying to sort of, there, it's a focused place. Sacrifices are to be offered, and the perpetual fire is to burn. There, the prescribed pilgrimages are to be made, and there, the festivals and assemblages are to be held every year. This is my notation. Note here, in this description of the commandment in the Torah to build a sanctuary for God, there is absolutely no reference to, no implication about God needing any sort of physical home or abode in the world. And so Maimonides was trying to suppress the what I've described as the proto-Kabbalistic view that God has needs, physical-like needs that we Jews help satisfy. But Maimonides, again, was to a large degree unsuccessful, and Nachmanides, who came after him, really paved this path in Kabbalah for believing, no, Jews perform commandments, and our whole Jewish legal system is designed, at least in part, to help satisfy needs of God. I want to bring you two modern scholars who really highlight the disparity, the divergence between Maimonides and Nachmanides, and really what their debate meant, what the repercussions were for Jewish thought in the centuries that have followed. Menachem Kellner in the Torah.com writes, there is a deeper debate here. Put crudely, for Nachmanides, so that's the Ramban, and Kabbalistic thinkers like him, the purpose of the tabernacle, as well as many other aspects of Judaism, is to bring God, as it were, down to earth. For Maimonides, on the other hand, so in stark contrast, it is the point of all Jewish practices to assist human beings in their striving to raise themselves, as it were, in the direction of God. According to Maimonides, the sacrifices have no intrinsic value. They are part of a complex, interconnected structure of institutions. All were commanded by God. All of them play an important role in the social world we call Judaism, but they play no role in the divine economy. They reflect our needs, not God's. So Kellner is highlighting this. You couldn't have a starker difference of opinion between Maimonides and Nachmanides on their respective conceptions of God and how much of Jewish tradition fits into their conceptions of God. Here's another scholarly excerpt from a very good book, Maimonides and the Shaping of the Jewish Canon. Professor Diamond there writes, their positions, and he's contrasting Maimonides and Nachmanides, diverged so drastically on notions such as providence, that means God's interaction and supervision in history, ritual, biblical history, and even the very nature of God, and thus what qualifies as authentic monotheism, that it would be no exaggeration to infer that they adhered to two different faiths. So Professor Diamond is saying, if you didn't know better, if you didn't know that Maimonides and Nachmanides were both great rabbinic figures in the same Jewish religion, you might think that they were actually advancing competing religions, because their views about God and about the interactive dynamic of the human realm and the divine realm, they were so dramatically different that they seemed to flow from different religious traditions. I've mentioned now many times that Maimonides was only partially successful in removing anthropomorphism from the Jewish tradition, and this idea that the commandments are sort of historically contingent and not part of the eternal fabric of the universe. This is an excerpt from a great book by Professor Jacob Katz from the Hebrew University, Tradition and Crisis. Professor Katz is one of the most important Jewish historians of the 20th century. And in that important book, he describes the culture of Judaism at the end of the Middle Ages, sort of before the onset of the modern period. And again, highlighting the impact of Kabbalah, which, as I described last session, emerged really in reaction to the Maimonidean agenda of religious reform. Kabbalah drew on other ancient roots that Maimonides was trying to suppress, and then they came to the surface and flowered in strong reaction to Maimonides' philosophical agenda. Professor Katz writes in that book, the major impact of the Kabbalah on the national plane is to be seen in a general shift in religious values. That shift was reflected in the new significance attached to performance of the practical commandments. So he's talking about how Jews perceived of the commandments that they were performing within the halachic, the Jewish legal tradition. While halachic and ethical literature of the time saw observance of the commandments as first and foremost obedience to the will of God, the Kabbalist, in contrast, viewed such observance of the commandments as a sort of mechanism for setting the machinery of the upper divine spheres in motion. Each tiny particular of each commandment was linked in this Kabbalistic scheme to a specific point in the divine system, and anyone who performed that commandment was thereby directing the operation of that system. This in turn determined not only the fate and reward of the individual who was performing the commandment, but also the advancement or retarding of the perfection of the whole world. So Kabbalah really advanced this view that that the system through which Jews perform the mitzvot, perform the commandments, actually has a substantial impact on God, the reality of God in the upper divine realm, and the way we observe commandments and the extent to which we fulfill the commandments actually helps repair certain deficiencies in the divine realm. That became a Kabbalistic perspective about what we as traditional Jews do, or what they did at the end, by the end of the medieval period. That Kabbalistic influence was quite dramatic. And as I've tried to convey, Maimonides was trying to avoid that outcome. He did not believe that the observance of our observance of the commandments had any impact on an unchanging God, and that God has no need for our observance of the commandments for his own needs. He revealed the Torah to us so that we can help perfect ourselves morally, spiritually, and that would lead to proper intellectual understanding of God. But the idea that our observance of commandments would have any impact on God would have been absolutely heretical to Maimonides. Now, I'm going to conclude this section with getting back to Maimonides and his view of the historically contingent nature of Jewish law, including in the Torah itself. This passage from Leviticus, the third book of the Torah, says, "You," meaning the men, "shall not round off the side growth on your head or destroy the side growth of your beard. Lo takifu pa'at roshchem velo tashchit et pa'at zkanecha." I happened to read this verse in shul a couple of weeks ago. And this is the source of our traditional practice, particularly among more traditionally oriented Jews, of having payas, that we shouldn't be shaving on the sides of our beard. And then another law that most rabbinic authorities feel is rationally inscrutable, that this is thought to be one of the chukim, the laws in the Torah that have no apparent rational explanation. In Deuteronomy, it says, "You shall not wear cloth combining wool and linen," meaning don't wear clothing combining wool and linen. Lo tilbash shatnez, so this is the law of shatnez. Semer ufishtim yachdav. Now, many rabbinic authorities through the centuries have said, well, we don't know why God instructed us to avoid this combination of wool and linen. It is simply God's will, and we show our subservience, our obedience to God by fulfilling this rationally inscrutable commandment of avoiding shatnez. Well, that was not Maimonides' view. Maimonides, as a rational thinker, was always trying to identify the reasons for laws in the Torah. Maimonides believed God, as sort of the embodiment of perfect intellect, must have had reasons, and good reasons, compelling reasons, for all the commandments that he instructed us in the Revelation. Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, writes, "We have already explained in our great compilation," he's referring to his Mishnah Torah, the most comprehensive, as I've noted, the most comprehensive legal code in Jewish history. Maimonides already explained there that the shaving of the corner of the head and of the corner of the beard has been forbidden because it was a usage of idolatrous priests at that time. So, like his explanation of the sacrifices, at the time, there were those idolatrous priests who were administering the idolatrous sacrificial practices. They had a practice of shaving the corners of their beard, and the Torah, to try to teach us the lesson to avoid any aspect of idolatry, Maimonides is telling us, said, don't shave there, as those idolatrous priests did. And so that explains this commandment from Leviticus, which otherwise has no particular explanation given in the Torah. And then Maimonides will go on to explain this mitzvah, this commandment in Deuteronomy about shatnez, the mixed clothing. Maimonides writes, "This is also the reason for the prohibition of shatnez, for this too was a usage of those idolatrous priests, as they put together in their garments vegetal," meaning linen is the analog, "and animal," The analog to that is wool. Substances bearing at the same time a seal made out of some mineral. You will find this set forth literally in their books. He must be referring to ancient idolatrous books that he was familiar with. So Maimonides, very strikingly, is saying the reason for both of those supposedly inscrutable laws that we are obliged to follow because God revealed those and gave us those instructions in the Torah. Well, there's actually an historically contingent explanation for them. It was due again to the idolatrous context in which the Israelites lived, and it was to teach them particular lessons in light of the surrounding idolatrous practices of the peoples with whom the Israelites were familiar. So again, the upshot of this is quite dramatic. Maimonides is suggesting, well, if things had been a bit different, if those idolatrous priests had different practices other than in terms of shaving their the corners of their beard, or for wearing particular combinations of elements in their clothing, if that were true, if it were different in terms of the idolatrous practices of the time of the Torah, God would have given different relevant instructions. So these commandments, these mitzvot in the Torah, according to Maimonides, are purely historically contingent. That doesn't mean we shouldn't obey them, that Jews through time should continue to observe them, but he wants to highlight that we can actually identify what their original context was and why they were given, and therefore why they could have been different had the original setting and context of the Torah been otherwise than what it was. This is another example of Maimonides' view that in the Jewish legal realm, in the halachic realm, frankly, errors can be made because if something is historically contingent, it's not necessarily the most important religious focus in our world, or it shouldn't be. According to Maimonides' sort of intellectual understanding of God, theological beliefs should be primary. And this is a passage from his Mishnah Torah. Maimonides writes there, in the event that a judge gave a mistaken decision in a non-capital case, if his mistake is one with regard to a matter that is obvious and well known, that is a mistake in a law that is explicitly stated in the Mishnah or the Gemara. So this is a mistake that a judge makes in a case, in a case between Jewish litigants, that the judge should not have made because the law was obviously not consistent with his decision. The erring judge's decision is revoked and the case reconsidered and decided according to the correct law. But if reversal is impossible, the judge is exempt from making good on the loss, for though he caused the loss, he did so unintentionally. The point I'm trying to highlight here is that for Maimonides, if you make a halachic, a Jewish legal mistake, it is correctable or forgivable. And your intentionality, matters. If you violate a law, or if you make a judge makes him, gives an incorrect decision purposefully, then that's a different matter. But if you do it inadvertently and unintentionally, mistakenly, it's not the worst thing in the world. That is in contrast to Maimonides' highlighting of religious theological convictions. And remember, in the last session, we saw that Maimonides believed that every Jew, no matter how simple and uneducated, needed to be trained in certain theological beliefs, and sort of inadvertence or unintentionality or just pure ignorance was not a good excuse and could cost a simple Jew his or her place in the world to come. And remember, Maimonides did say in the passage that I focused on last week, even women who within the Jewish legal system had an inferior position, everyone in the Jewish society had to be trained to have proper theological convictions, because inadvertence, unintentionality, ignorance were not excuses in the theological realm, but they could be excuses in the Jewish legal realm, which again is a very non-traditional view. And this is sort of a summary of Maimonides' view of commandments. In the guide, the whole system of our mitzvot, he writes, Rather, things are indubitably as we have already mentioned. Every commandment from among these 613 commandments, representing all the commandments from the Torah and otherwise in the tradition, exists either with a view to communicating a correct opinion, and he means a correct theological opinion about God, or to putting an end to an unhealthy opinion, or to communicating a rule of justice, or to warding off an injustice, or to endowing people with a noble moral quality, or to warning them against an evil moral quality. Thus, Maimonides sums up, all the commandments are bound up with three things: opinions, moral qualities, and political civic actions. So, and this is my notation, that is, the commandments are designed by God to teach truth, meaning truth about the universe and about God's essence, to inculcate proper morality, and to institute justice in society. And Maimonides makes no mention at all that the commandments are designed to effect any change vis-a-vis God's structure or God's essence or the divine realm in general, which again it became a motif of the Kabbalistic thought that Maimonides was trying to suppress, and he didn't succeed in rooting it out completely. Kabbalistic thought became quite popular, and in Kabbalistic thought, there was the very powerful notion that the way we perform commandments actually has a significant impact on God, on the divine realm, and can help fix and cure certain deficiencies with respect to God's essence, that it is our responsibility and our privilege to help cure. So Maimonides would have absolutely rejected that notion, that reading, that interpretation, that understanding of the system of mitzvot, the system of commandments in the Jewish tradition. Okay. I'm getting toward the end of my source sheet, and I'll open it up for questions. As I mentioned, I want to engage, as we wrap up this last session, in some, what I'm calling Maimonidean thought experiments. We had one earlier in which I imagined what Judaism would look like had God been able to skip the whole stage of sacrificial worship, because Maimonides believed that was a primitive form of worship that should be overcome over time. And so if God had been able to skip that, what would Judaism have looked like? So I'm going to do some additional thought experiments, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have about these. First, I want to identify in all candor what I think are problematic aspects of Maimonides' thought for Jews today. So all of these thought experiments are designed to place Maimonides in the contemporary Jewish world, to show how Maimonidean thought has impacted the Jewish world, how it has been resisted in the Jewish world. And I want to start by trying to catalog the ways in which Maimonides, his thought was problematic, I think, for many of us. So the first bullet, despite being universalist, meaning, as I've described it, that Maimonides believed that that intellectual knowledge of God was in theory available to all human beings. You didn't have to be Jewish to reach a certain level of intellectual knowledge of God. And by the way, that certain level of intellectual knowledge of God would automatically bring you, as a consequence, into a participation in the world to come. So despite it being sort of open to a broader set of people than traditional Jewish thinking would allow, Maimonidean thought is also very intellectually elitist in a way that I think is problematic, because for Maimonides, intellectual knowledge of God is a very demanding goal. You have to be quite sophisticated philosophically. It's not, just the simple Jew likely cannot achieve the sort of intellectual knowledge of God that Maimonides is advocating for. And therefore, as I said, immortality, which is one's share in the world to come, which was, extremely important to traditional Jews, both in pre-modern times and also in our own time. Immortality is almost purely an intellectual endeavor. Maimonides believed you had to be a morally good person to be equipped to reach that level of intellectual achievement. But as the next bullet indicates, proper behavior is really subservient to that project of intellectual achievement. And all of that sort of intellectual elitism of Maimonides can be viewed as problematic, that only a certain subset of humanity and a subset of Jews, even if they're otherwise quite pious, will achieve immortality in the world to come. Another, I think, not just problematic, but perhaps even dangerous byproduct of Maimonides is his focus on theological dogmas, is that sort of dogmatic theological orthodoxy leads to heresy witch hunts, and that goes back to the Slifkin affair that I was mentioning earlier, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who was targeted for heresy by simply trying to follow in Maimonides' footsteps. So ironically, Maimonides sort of created the platform in his focus on theological convictions, on there being principles of faith that Jews should hold about God, and about Jewish life, that leads to the outcome. If you don't hold those dogmatic beliefs, other Jews can accuse you of heresy, which is that sort of heresy hunting is problematic. I think also the entire aspect of Jewish life that is particularistic, everything that distinguishes us as Jews in terms of our behavior, the commandments we follow, the Hebrew language that we use, the land of Israel that we focus on, that is at risk of becoming less important within Jewish life if one is a strict Maimonidean, because again, Maimonides believed that even non-Jews could reach certain levels of intellectual perfection. So those non-Jews had no need for any Jewish particularism. And so there's a risk of our Jewish identity, the uniqueness of our Jewish identity, becoming obscured. And finally, the focus on this philosophically depicted God who is unchanging, really, as I've said, is not a warm and fuzzy God that Jews can relate to. It can be seen that notion of God can be seen as distant, remote, uninvolved in our lives. And a byproduct of that alienation, I'll call it, from God, could be that we find less meaning, less comfort in our prayer, because we don't think the prayer really matters, because God is not going to do anything different as a result of it. And the traditional messianic hope that the world can be changed through what we do in this world could be diminished. Now, I'm not going to get into Maimonides' whole notion of the messianic period. He did believe in a messianic period and that our behavior could bring it about, but he had a very naturalistic view of it, which I think is actually attractive, that if his view is in the messianic period would simply be distinguished by essentially political peace brought about by everyone sort of coming to the right realizations about God. But the notion that we can pray to a God to bring about a certain messianic redemption, I think can be undercut by Maimonidean thought. Our next thought experiment, perhaps our most important: how would Judaism differ today had Maimonides never lived at all? And I think these are, I've tried to set the stage for these conclusions, which indicate that a Judaism today, without the presence of Maimonides in our tradition, would be just dramatically different. First, just as a Jewish legal matter, there may never have been an authoritative, wide-ranging code of Jewish law. I've suggested that the Shulchan Aruch, which is considered sort of the building block these days of traditional Jewish easy access to Jewish laws, may never have come about had Maimonides' Mishnah Torah not been written first. There would have been, I think, less focus on dogmatic theological consistency, which I just suggested may actually be a better thing. Maybe Maimonides' focus on theological dogmas hurt Judaism in the long run. But on the other hand, the Kabbalistic patterns of thought and motifs that Maimonides tried to suppress, again, only partially successfully, would have been much more dominant. So I think Judaism would have been more heavily superstitious, theurgic. That means that the things we do in the lower realm here on earth have an impact on the divine realm above. Again, Maimonides rejected that dynamic. And we would have more of an enchanted form of Judaism. What I mean by that is, I think there would be more of a role of intermediaries between us and God. The universe would be populated more by angels and demons and other sorts of intermediaries, which are a real element of mystical Kabbalistic thought. God would be seen as subject to greater human manipulation in a way that I've said Maimonides would have totally rejected. Anthropomorphic conceptions of God would be more pervasive. I think that is absolutely true, that we may take for granted the fact that we don't look at God as having physical form, but had Maimonides never been around and taught Jews not to think of God literally in physical terms, I think those conceptions that are the plain sense of the Bible and the plain sense of many rabbinic passages would really have sort of won the day. Importantly, I think there'd be a diminished perception of the shared humanity of Jews and the billions of non-Jews in the world. We are only a very small fraction of the people of the world's population. And as I started the class off in session 1, Maimonides almost started everything from the first few passages in Genesis that indicated that we are all created in the image of God, meaning not just Jews, but all of humanity shares that sense of divinity. And by what Maimonides meant by that was our capacity to think intellectually. But had Maimonides not pressed that point, I think traditional Judaism would have had less of a focus that we actually share much in common with non-Jews. I think it would be a heavier race-based Judaism and a reduced openness to converts who obviously have a different biological lineage. And that goes back to our discussion about Yehuda Halevi, who preceded Maimonides in the medieval period and really believed that born Jews had something better, intrinsically better than both non-Jews and converted Jews. So I think Yehuda Halevi's race-based brand of Judaism would have been more dominant than it is today. I think there'd be a reduced creativity and a reduced openness to doing what Maimonides did, which was to integrate Torah on the one hand and reason on the other hand. And correspondingly, I think there would be greater skepticism that those two things could be made compatible, that there would really be any possibility of demonstrating that Torah is actually compatible with advances in secular culture. And remember that Maimonides indicated that we should seek the truth from whatever the source, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. So as a result of all these things, I think traditional forms of Judaism would be more insular, more inward-looking, less open to exploring the outside secular world that Maimonides believed had a lot to offer Judaism and Jews. And finally, that there would be even greater reliance on a certain portion of the traditional world today believes that rabbinic authorities are virtually infallible with respect to anything they say. So not just Jewish legal matters, but with respect to politics and ethics and all sorts of matters that one might argue fall outside of their what should be their realm of influence, or certainly their realm of expertise, if they're talking about certain scientific matters or policy matters that they're not expert in. But there's a large part of the traditional Jewish world that thinks that their rabbinic authorities are virtually infallible. The concept is called Da'at Torah, that those rabbinic authorities must be followed and heeded with respect to almost anything they say, not just confined to Jewish law. Finally, the last thought experiment. Maimonides, of course, wrote his great philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed. he was trying to guide his contemporary sophisticated Jews um, through the thicket of reconciling Torah on the one hand and philosophical principles on the other hand. So 800 years later, I'm trying to imagine what would Maimonides have addressed today had he written the Guide of the Perplexed for 21st century Jews. And these are just a few of the things he might have covered in the Guide of the Perplexed for the 21st century. I think he would have tried to tease out the interaction of modern biblical criticism, meaning the notion that the Torah has multiple authors and sources and that it developed over time, how that interacts with traditional commitments. And I will say there are a lot of resources available today that that do address that that dynamic. I've mentioned it many times, but the Torah.com is a website that goes exactly to that intriguing and problematic interaction of biblical criticism and commitments to Jewish tradition. Secondly, I think Maimonides would try to guide us in our approach to what I think are almost objectively problematic elements of the Torah in terms of contemporary morality and ethics. I'll just mention a couple of problems in that when you read passages in the Torah about sort of extinguishing certain Canaanite peoples, that raises the specter of genocide. Of there is slavery still in the Torah, and again that can be explained as well. That was sort of a necessary phase in what Maimonides might have called primitive Judaism that became obsolete over time. But nevertheless, it's still an aspect of the Torah when we read it today. Blasphemers, we read recently, should be put to death, the Torah tells us. Well, in terms of freedom of speech, that's a problematic issue. Next, a huge topic, theological explanations of recurring immense evil in the world. Obviously, most notably the Holocaust, but it's become, again, a real theological problem in the aftermath of October 7th. And I think, or I would hope, Maimonides would address that in a philosophical work designed to help us navigate the problems of the contemporary world. Maimonides, I will say, was an optimist. He thought the world itself is good and that evil in the world is generally just a byproduct of human beings misusing the wonderful resources that God has given us, or otherwise simply being natural processes in the world. But Maimonides did not live through the Holocaust, and he didn't, for that matter, didn't live through the Spanish Inquisition. So he didn't live through eras of intense persecution of Jews that he might have been prompted to have to explain in a 21st century Guide to the Perplexed. Interestingly, I think he would have had something to say, or should have had something to say, about the role of Jewish authority in Zionist perspectives and politics. There's rabbinic authorities in Israel get involved in trying to shape Zionist policies and how the state of Israel plays out its own history. I think Maimonides would have something to say about that, because I think he wanted rabbinic figures to sort of confine themselves to Jewish legal matters, and philosophically, again, the world of intellectual truth was available to everyone, and rabbinic authorities had no particular expertise in anything, according to Maimonides, in anything other than Jewish law. And so I end up by asking, should there be a separation of powers in Jewish authority? Should we allow rabbinic figures? And this is more a problem in the ultra-Orthodox world, but it has spilled over to issues in religious Zionism in the state of Israel. Should we allow rabbinic figures to interject themselves in matters of politics and policy in which they have no particular expertise? I'm going to end this session, then open it up to questions with a couple of texts that I think go to Maimonides being what I've said can be an inspirational paradigm or role model for us. So Not everything Maimonides said, as I showed in that list of how Maimonides' thought, I think, is problematic in certain respects for contemporary Jews. But I think his approach to dealing with the world can be a source of inspiration and could be established as a paradigm for us to follow. This is from a book review by Jay Harris, who was one of my teachers in my graduate program in Jewish Studies, who's now a professor for many, many, many years at Harvard. Professor Harris writes in a book review of this really wonderful book by Moshe Halbertal about Maimonides. It was a very, very positive, favorable book review. Professor Harris writes, Maimonides' work represents a powerful bastion against the retreat from rationality that too often accompanies contemporary discourse, religious and otherwise. Maimonides insisted that the religious mind should not embrace the absurd or imagine that one honors God by resisting science and human understanding, fallible though they may be. He urged the faithful to include the study of the natural world in their quest for a righteous and loving God, or risk, if they did not do that, risk falling prey to powerful anxieties and urges that sow confusion and fear. For Maimonides, only religion informed by science and philosophy could allow believers to be at peace with the world and its complex reality, instead of their retreating from reality into a world of imagined demons and angels, literal or metaphoric. And I think Professor Harris really captures what I think really is inspirational and instructive about Maimonides, the example of his life, that he tried to integrate tradition and reason and incorporate the best of what his contemporary world offered him. My final text, I wanted Maimonides to have the last word. So this final text is from his epistle, his letter to the Jewish community in Yemen in the year 1173. That small Jewish community was suffering from intense persecution at the time, and they wrote to Maimonides asking for advice about how to deal with all of that, all those tsuris and the persecution they were suffering. And not only is this passage, I think, very poignant in light of our post-October 7th world, but it demonstrates, despite Maimonides being very philosophically sophisticated, I don't want you to leave with the impression that he was an austere philosopher who had no connection to and care for the Jewish community. He was the source of great counsel, advice, and support to Jewish communities all over the world who turned to him for his insight about and his advice about how they should handle the realities that they were experiencing. So that's what the Jewish community of Yemen did in 1173. And I think this is a very powerful way to end our discussion and to really show you that Maimonides was the preeminent, most prominent leader of the Jewish community worldwide of his time. So he wasn't just immersed in his philosophical books, but he was a caring, insightful, supportive leader of Jewish communities around the world. He wrote to them, "Persecutions are of short duration. Indeed, God assured our father Jacob that although his children would be humbled and overcome by the nations, they and not the nations would survive and endure. God declares in the Torah to Abraham, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. That is to say, although Jews will be abased like the dust that is trodden underfoot, they will ultimately emerge triumphant and victorious. And as the simile implies, just as the dust settles finally upon him who tramples upon it and remains after him, so too will Israel outlive its oppressors. The Lord has given us assurance through his prophets that we are indestructible and imperishable, and we will always continue to be a preeminent community. As it is impossible for God to cease to exist, so too is our destruction and disappearance from the world unthinkable." And I just wanted to end with that. What I hope is sort of an uplifting source of hopefulness. Maimonides was embedded in the Jewish world He was, in some of his writings, speaking to a subset of his fellow Jews, but he wrote many, many letters of communication to Jews around the world, helping them navigate the complexities and challenges that they were enduring. And I think he could be the same source of inspiration and guidance for Jews in the 21st century. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Happy to try to sum up in the next few minutes anything that you might want to ask. Laura. Laura, you have to unmute yourself.
So it's going to be a little complex, but my real question will end up being, our founding fathers who were in the mid 1800s, and that's when the Enlightenment came. And they were basically deists, or they were considered theistic rationalists. So they believe in a God who created, and that was pretty much it. And then they believed in having a moral, ethical code, belief, and behaviors. Why do we need to believe if the God of Maimonides, and I'm asking because this is my question in real life anyway, if it's a non-intervening God, and you mentioned it, Mark, what is the role of communal prayer? Why do we need personal prayer? Why do we need communal prayer? Why do we have to believe that there is a God who, if God gave us the Torah and the commandments, the prescriptions and the proscriptions, and created the world, and gave us the ability to have rational thought and intelligence, what do we need God for now? What do we need religion for now?
Right.
Sorry
So
about that.
you've summed up sort of Maimonidean thought well. So what distinguishes, I'll just make the point that perhaps you were making explicitly, I just want to make sure it's evident to everyone. What distinguishes Maimonides' God from the God of the deists is that God did more than just create the world. God actually both has intervened, according to Maimonides again, intervened periodically in history through miracles. So it's not the pure traditional view of miracles, but Maimonides did believe that God injected sort of miraculous events into the fabric of nature. So that's one way that the Jewish God from Maimonides was distinguishable. But secondly, the massive difference is that he revealed to us the Torah. So we shouldn't underplay the importance of the Torah for Maimonides. Yes, non-Jews also had theoretical access to intellectual truth about God, but what non-Jews lacked was this tremendous head start and gift that God gave to us through the Torah. Maimonides believed that the Torah was the best means to an end available to anyone in the world. So God revealed through the gift of his relationship with the descendants of Abraham. He gave us the Torah, and having the Torah really gives us a big head start, a big advantage over non-Jews. So that's a massive role of God in history. Having said that, you're right. That sort of what happens next is really, I think, for Maimonides, up to us. That he says we humans have the opportunity and the responsibility and the mandate to help perfect the world through rational advances and applying our rationality to using our resources correctly, treating each other properly, and thinking about God in the right way. We can help perfect the world and therefore sort of naturalistically bring about the messianic period. So yes, it is true. God doesn't have much of a role to play in the post-revelation world, other than being the object of our focus for Maimonides, having given us the gift of Torah, and in addition becoming the object of our intellectual knowledge and love. And to the extent that Maimonides says over and over again in various places, our focus in life should be developing our relationship with God. So yes, it's a less supervisory, interactive role of God, but nevertheless, the relationship between mankind and God was at least as important for Maimonides, as with any other Jewish thinker. So it's a really good question, Laura. it's a complex answer. It's a non-traditional view that Maimonides held about the continuing role of God in history. But Maimonides was God obsessed and focused. So, and the Torah still is the most wonderful tool that humankind has. Any other questions? You can either talk or put up an electronic hand. Okay. I want to thank everyone for, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank everyone for joining me on this journey through Maimonidean thought. I hope you've gained some appreciation for both why Maimonides is really so important to the Jewish tradition, what he was trying to accomplish, yet what the forces were that he was trying to suppress that sort of emerged afterwards to create the contemporary Judaism that we live in today, that is part Maimonidean and part very much not Maimonidean. But the reality is, if you go into any yeshiva in the world, they will hold the Rambam, is how they refer to Maimonides, the Rambam, in absolutely the highest prestige. There could be no greater rabbinic authority than Maimonides. But I've tried to convey to you some themes about Maimonidean thought that perhaps those in the yeshiva world either don't know about or don't take the time to explore. So thank you again. I appreciate your participation. Hope to see many or all of you back for next year's class.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. It was
Mark.
wonderful.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Have a good rest of the day.